Hello and good afternoon, Ukrainian existing e-Democrats and hopefully new e-Democrats. My name is Jordanka Tomkova. I am from the Swiss Innova Bridge Foundation, and we are working in Ukraine and have been working for the past 2 years on a specific program called the E-Governance for Accountability and Participation, also known as EGAP program. So I'm working in Ukraine in this capacity. And today I would like to collaborate with the PART NGO from Vinica to introduce this web seminar. And the topic that I would like to talk about, based on my experience, international experience, is on the trends of e-democracy development in the world. So, as part of the presentation, I would like to tell you a little bit about the history. Although we think that new technologies are fairly new, there has been kind of an evolving trend of e-democracy development, if you will, from its earlier stages to today. And I will also look at some current, but also where is e-democracy going in the future. So some kind of contemporary trends where e-democracy is going, because it's going very fast, you know, with the speed of internet and ICT or information communication technology development and innovation. There's new and new tools coming on the market and are being distributed in the public. So I'm going to also look at where are these new trends going. I would also like to then look at, maybe from some experience, we have implemented, or the world has implemented in different countries, different instruments. And I would like to just look and step back on some lessons learned and some challenges that come with implementing e-democracy instruments, whether it's for NGOs or for government or for citizens. And lastly, I would like to give you some questions to think about, how to maybe think about e-democracy in Ukraine, because it's a very fast developing sector in Ukraine and it's very exciting. So maybe something for you to think about as you walk away from this seminar series. So I will start first with some trends. You know, what's very important in e-democracy is to not think about the electronic without thinking the offline, the regular face-to-face. Because actually e-democracy developed first as a response to what was happening offline. And offline we saw that in the 1960s and until 1990, there has been a trend of looking, especially in political science, on how to better engage citizens in political processes. There has been an increasing trend of seeing that citizens are withdrawing from classical political processes. One good indicator is that less and less people are going to the voting booth to vote during elections. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. This is happening in United States, it is happening in UK, it's happening in Japan, it's happening in Ukraine, it's happening all over the world. So the question is, and also people are disengaging from political processes in general. There is a tendency towards issue-based politics, so people are going from let's say more general political processes to specific. So people who are interested in ecology are starting to get more engaged into ecological issues and political processes like activism for citizens and so on. So there is different trends that are happening offline. And it's very important to think also about technology and instruments, how they have a dialogue or respond to what's already happening offline. So just to summarize that between 1960 with the Vietnam War in the US, and as I said, also seeing different trends in political science where people are disengaging from politics, the, let's say, political community started to respond, how can they engage citizens more interestingly in the political process? And there's also more interest to engage into deliberative processes, so how people can communicate better and deliberate in democratic settings. And then, of course, in the 1990s until 2000 and onwards came kind of a boom with information communication technology. First, it was very commercial, and as we know, internet came from the defense industry, and then it was commercialized, and slowly it penetrated into the public domain. So in 2000 to 2016, we also see this idea that was forming, let's say, in political circles or political science circles, to start to be formalized in a few, let's say, global documents. So in 2001 and 2003, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is based in Paris, released two very important reports on civic participation, citizens as partners, and it had in 2003 a follow-up report. Then you had the World Summit on Information Society, also in 2001 and 2005, and since then it has been an annual practice where it's talked about the concept of new technologies and how they're affecting society in general, and then more specifically the political process. So there has been kind of a dialogue between, as I said, the political process offline and then the incoming new technologies and how to deal with them in our everyday society. So this concept of citizens as partners and proximity to the people was enshrined in quite a few documents. And then when we see in practice, so this was, let's say, normative, in the normative circles. Also, the EU Lisbon Treaty in 2009 had inserted the proximity to the people, how the European Union can be closer to European citizens. And it has adopted the European Citizens Initiative, which is a pan-European petitions platform that is also online as one instrument. So we see that more and more legislative or normative documents are including technologies as an instrument to engage citizens more in the political process. Now, in practice, as this was happening on the political side, in practice we also see that people and citizens are taking technologies and are applying them in everyday situations, especially political. One of the ones that a little bit broke, let's say, burst the bubble, it's not so maybe super famous, but in, let's say, civic participation circle it is, was the 2000 Saffron Revolution in Myanmar or Burma, where the Buddhist monks had mobile technology. As you may know, Myanmar is a dictatorship, has a dictatorship as a government, and there was suppression, increasing suppression of civil society and civic rights. So the Buddhist monks stood up. They are a very strong force in a civil society, and there was a backlash from the government that used violence against these Buddhist monks. Now, what happened? The Buddhist monks used actually mobile phones to start using social networking sites like Twitter and Facebook to communicate to the world and to mass media of what was happening in Burma, because the government had a complete censorship on what was happening. So the conventional media was forbidden to cover the events, the political events, the protests. But the use of technologies, which was mobile phones, were tweeting out and Facebooking to the world, showing what was happening in Myanmar. The world reacted, and there was quite a bit of attention paid, and the conventional or mass media caught up and covered the Saffron Revolution in Burma. So this was one of the first kind of, let's say, bigger international examples. The second one that started to, where we started to really look at the power of technology in politics was the Obama election campaign in 2009 when he was first elected. He used very clever and proactive use of technologies, but not only Obama, but he gave this, let's say, he empowered citizens to do so themselves. We saw increasing amount of crowdsourcing and funding, where before a lot of funding for political campaigning was done through corporate or let's say formal channels. During the Obama campaign, what changed is that people started to use it also as a crowdfunding. So the Obama campaign got quite a lot of funds generated through civic campaigns. Also, it was used for mobilizing civic activists for elections, for door-to-door campaigning, for advertising. So there was a lot of activity, and the Obama, let's say, electoral team was very clever to use this, and it's taken as a very first example on how to do elections campaigning with technologies right. The next one, what we saw is massive protest with the use of also mobile technologies during the Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011, where again mobile phones were used on civic-to-civic interaction to mobilize people to come to the Tahrir Square in Cairo to boycott the government. It received a lot of international attention, again, as a result of networking. So it was used for domestic mobilization or inside Egypt, but it also started to use the power of technology to communicate out to the rest of the world what was happening in Egypt. Lastly, we know the WikiLeaks. That was also a very interesting, let's say, new phenomena, where you had very technically savvy activists, hackers, leaking information that was classified, or it was, not shown to the public, and because of their specific IT skills, released it in the public domain. And again, there is a combination of tools that were used, where then the social media and also mass media caught on to this and started to make the issue viral. So it got into all households and created a lot of. So it's a very interesting kind of evolution of different types of examples over the course of time that kind of showed the power of the use of technology in different political spaces. Now, what I would like to say that 2016 and let's say last year and onwards, I will try to pick up here to show you also some concrete examples where the trend is going. In the let's say in this era, there was an emergence of a lot of single instruments. So the implementation of e-petitions as an instrument. The implementation of e-campaigning or political campaigning during elections as, let's say, as another, as e-polling, e-consultations. So there was a lot of single government websites, just simple government websites for transparency purposes. So there were a lot of single tools emerging. What we see now, the trend, and even more so in the future, is not only that these tools are becoming more sophisticated, but there's an integration of more than one tool into sort of, let's say, super tools or mega tools. And I will cover that in the forthcoming. But before I go that, it's maybe good to a little bit ask what actually is e-democracy. This is supposed to be an introductory seminar, so this is an important question to answer. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. E-democracy, it's true, it is a very packed concept or a more complex concept because it deals with a lot of dynamic processes, tools, people responding to them. But basically, there is some standard, let's say, building blocks in the definition. And one of the most basic and simple logical expectation is the use of new technologies, internet enhanced, or increasingly mobile, with mobile applications that are strengthening transparency, accountability, civic participation, and also deliberation and public education. These three are typically known as the TAP principles. The T standing for transparency, A for accountability, and P for participation. These are kind of three golden, let's say, building blocks of good governance. And then this is a very important component is this public education and deliberation, is how to also use the tools to educate the public. And we see that most instruments have a very strong kind of civic education and information sharing component. So this is less talked about, but in my view it's a very important part also of e-democracy, is this reaching out to civic populations with new information that they may not get through conventional media, and also that the citizens can choose themselves where they go and what information they look at. So this is a basic definition. Use of technologies for transparency, accountability, participation, and civic education or public education. Now, in addition to this basic definition, it is also important to look at e-democracy, as I mentioned earlier, as an, we could call it as an e-enabler. So the technology is helping us to do something that we couldn't do before. And we can ask, what is it exactly? What is new about technology? There is quite a bit of research showing that actually a lot of technology, the behavior that we assume using technology tends to emulate or repeat the similar types of behavior that we had offline. So in academic circles, some skeptics ask, is simply technology enabling us to do the same, just in a new environment that we already do offline? So if you are an activist offline, chances are very high that you will be an extrovert and activist online. Or is there something really new in technology that is enabling us to do something differently, do something better? We certainly hope it's the case, and many times, let's say the early research, I worked a little bit in the academic area before I came in Ukraine, and there was a very kind of optimistic side to using internet, and everything was possible politically. It would bring, it will be the panacea or solution to the lack of civic participation. But then as research had evolved, we found out maybe the story is not so clear, and it is very important to a little bit understand the more complex aspects of e-democracy. But maybe this is not for this seminar. But this slide, what I would like to say is go a little bit more, push the agenda of seeing e-democracy instruments to go beyond what just the instrumental value. So they're enablers. So something that is new is that they are giving us access to information, and we know that information and knowledge is actually power in a lot of sense. They're 24/7 available, so if people have access to the internet, they have access 24/7, that means 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to information is at their disposal, with which they can eventually use for their own purposes. This is new, because before you would have to either read the newspaper or go to a government agency or an NGO to get, let's say, information on ecological issues. This way you can sit at home, click, look at the NGO's website, and get the information faster to use it for maybe your own activism in your own community. It's about speed. Let's say in Arab Spring or protests, or even in the case of Euromaidan in Ukraine, the social media networks were used very effectively to get people and mobilize people very fast in a very particular time. So it's giving us speed. The one-to-many and many-to-many capacity of technology, that it's enabling us to communicate in much more, let's say, multidimensional ways. It's something new. And also, it reduces transaction costs. Although the onset investment of buying, let's say, computers and infrastructure and even instruments, developing software, is maybe expensive. If you look at the long-term value of technologies, they do reduce transaction costs, be it distance reducing, so you don't have to go to the office physically, or you don't have to go to the public hearing. This is particularly also useful for more disadvantaged parts of population, such as disabled people or elderly people who may not have the energy but still would like to participate. It's an important factor. It also reduces financial costs. The cost of participation is very expensive. To put on a public hearing for people to come, to, let's say, distribute materials, it is actually costly to put it all together. So we see that with technology, putting everything online in one place and not having to have all these added costs is actually cost reducing. The other thing that is enabling us to do is the polyvocality. We hear more voices. Before, the political domain was dominated by conventional media, experts, which are still very important in a very particular role. On the other hand, the new technologies are giving space and tools to regular people that may have very important things to say and just their opinion in the public domain to be shared. This is very new. You know, as I said before, it was kept in the private spheres, in households, in many civic circles. Now people can go into various chat rooms to discuss issues, to think about, to exchange ideas with others, and it's new. The other thing is disintermediation. It removed intermediaries. In other words, every citizen, if he or she has access to internet or mobile phone, can get access to information by themselves with the choice that they're making. Before, again, you know, one would need either NGOs, one would need experts, or mass media who would package information. This is very democratizing. This direct democracy aspect, you know, this is getting closer to that citizen is in charge of information, of getting information, participating, putting out information, receiving information without anybody intervening in that process, apart from, let's say, technology and access to technology. What is also important to understand in the context of e-democracy is that it's very much linked also to the offline world. I made that point earlier, and I would like to emphasize that because we'll come later also, is that political culture in each country matters. We see that many times, yes, sure, all different countries have e-petitions instruments. Different countries use e-consultations or have government websites. But still, if we analyze how citizens use them, how government uses these tools, how media responds to them, and how they are creating dynamics, are still very much linked to the political culture or specificity of a political culture in a particular country. For example, if we look at Ukraine, and we did some research in the EGAP program, also with other civil society partners in Ukraine, on the status of e-democracy here in Ukraine, we see that in Ukraine, most of the tools that are being developed are in the transparency area. You can ask why. Well, you know, as Ukrainians, that access to information and openness of government, corruption issues, let's say the assets declaration of parliamentarians, this information was often disclosed from the public by the political elite or the system. Now, with new technologies, it is possible in a more powerful way to put this information in the public. And in Ukraine, one sees a very good example of what is going offline, let's say the lack of information in the citizens' hands, to now more information with the use of new technology tools. So this is also in the case of Switzerland or in the case of United States or other countries, that e-democracy and the use of instruments is often a response to the existing political culture in the particular country. So it's context specific. And here it's also important to think about that when you see examples that I will mention, you know, in other countries, they may work in a particular country with particular effect. That may happen again in another country if you were to take that tool, but it also may not, because again, the political culture and socio-political dynamics in a particular country matter. So always when designing tools, it's important to think, especially when one is importing tools, is to think about these issues. How is it fitting in my political context? How are the users? Are they similar, different than the ones that were using it elsewhere? So something important. I will go fast through these other aspects that also e-democracy tools and technology, it's a means to an end. It is not an end in itself. It means that tools are just tools. So e-petitions, as I said, e-consultations, government websites, asset declaration, let's say disclosures online, are only tools to get a bigger effect or an end, which is making government more accountable, to disclose information to the public, to have the truth. So it's always important to think, why am I using a particular tool, to what effect? They're process driven, and they're continually evolving. So this is a challenge and an opportunity that we see that technologies are moving very fast and the tools are becoming more interesting, more user-friendly, more sophisticated. At the same time, it's difficult for people to catch up with the speed of things. You know, as soon as you end up using one tool, there are 3 new that have been already introduced on the market. And every time it takes a bit of adjustment to learn about the power of a tool, the specificity, also skill sets often associated to launch tools. So this is kind of a positive and a negative aspect. And last thing is that it also means different things to different people. I will go faster with this one. What's also, again, this slide is to demonstrate that you can look at the tools in different ways. You can look at when are you using particular tool. Let's say, many of the tools are trying to affect some kind of political process, political space, and in, for example, e-participation tools such as e-consultations, e-petitions, also some civic, let's say, or public education tools, online campaigning by civic activists before a particular policy is being, let's say, legislated on. Different tools are used in different parts of the policy-making process. So, for example, in agenda setting, when the government is deciding, let's say, whether to introduce a new transport tax or not, civil society would maybe use very different types of tools than they would in decision-making process. In decision-making process, it's typically e-voting tools. So let's say e-voting mechanisms and ranking mechanisms that enable decision-making. Well, in agenda setting, one would use more, let's say, information campaigns, go heavy on getting citizens' input, so discussion fora, and so on. In policy formulation, the government can use e-consultations, so the use of technology to get civic or citizens' inputs, or experts' inputs. And in implementation, one tends to use monitoring or performance monitoring, let's say dashboard or trackers. So this just shows you that in different parts of the process of political, different instruments are more effective. What's also important to think about is what is the desired outcome? Again, what instrument are you using for what purpose? There's many times a tendency, especially in civil society, to jump on something new that they heard is working, that it's hot, and they adopt it without really fully thinking what is it they're doing. And it's also not only civil society, but it's also in government. Many times government officials want to respond to some kind of civic demand or media criticism, and they pick up a tool and they implement it. I saw many misdesigned or mistargeted tools because people haven't thought more strongly or thoroughly about the design aspect of a tool. Again, why am I using it and what outcomes or results I would like to get concretely from the tool, rather than just launching it because we hear it's hot, because others are using it. So it's very important to look at the desired outcomes and the level of influence you want. Also, this is an interesting aspect, is the supply, the demand factors. Who is supplying the tool and why, and who is on the receiving side, and what is the relationship. You know, you have the classic C2G, you may have heard also in literature, the C2G, G2G, G2C, so it's citizens to government, government to government, or citizen to government. Now, each of those vectors, I did not put that diagram here, has again a list of specific tools that can be used more effectively in some of these relationships than in others. They also imply power relationships, and that's something to also think about when one is using instrument. So to summarize this slide, I just put these things for you to kind of think about, again, when you are using tools, what should inform your decisions, because all of these factors, in fact, let's say, affect or influence the impact of the tool and what you're going to get out of it. The whole idea about the tool is that it should be useful to somebody to do something, whether it's so. This is another thing, this is more for monitoring, so the bigger picture of e-democracy. How do we know that e-democracy is working? Let's say we end up using a whole bunch of tools in our civil society, because this is, again, the purpose of these tools is to make, let's say, offline democracy more effective, more engaging, more participatory, more inclusive. This is what we would like to use the e-democracy tools for. But then again, let's say we end up using them and everybody is using them, how can we step back and think about what are we gaining out of the experience? It's very important. It's important about the cycle is not only to use the tools, but every now and then to step back and to say, hey, what did we learn in the process? What lessons can we take for next time around that we use a tool? And every time that we use and put on these little, let's say, complex processes, we certainly learn new things, and it's very important. So this is back to the point that also the use of e-democracy tools, it's a process, and it's continually evolving, we're learning and so on. But there are some ways one can, you know, there are different, let's say, global indices or indicators that can measure different aspects of e-democracy in a particular country, at a particular level, say local democracy level. At the national level, let's say more macro level indicators are the breadth or the scope, the number of e-democracy policies or legislation. So is there a national legislative environment that's enabling e-democracy to function in a particular country? This would be one way that a political scientist would look at. Is there an enabling legislative environment? Then is there a practice? Is there a healthy or vibrant practice of e-democracy in a particular country? One would look at the number and the types of e-democracy instruments. Then at the micro level, one would look at the users. Who are the users? How many? I mean, it's wonderful that you can have a lot of, let's say, e-petitions instruments, as it's in the case of Ukraine right now. There was a law introduced in Ukraine last year on e-petitions, and there are a lot of different e-petitions instruments being introduced, you know, at the presidential administration level. The cabinet of ministers launched last year. Also, the local governments are using e-petitions tools. The question then remains, okay, we could put a check mark here. Okay, there is an adopted practice. More tools are being implemented. Very good. Then the question still remains, how many users does it have? Who uses these instruments? Are they merely political activists who are using it to politicize and to further their, let's say, agendas? Or is it also ordinary citizens that are able to get their views across and participate in the process? So these are all very important things to think about. And then also one wants to look at not only the mechanics, the laws and the tools and who is using them, but also the effect. So what kind of outputs or attributable change that we can add to e-democracy instruments? What were they, at the end of the day, enabling us to do? Were they enabling us to do through an e-petitions instruments? Did we gain a new community project, for example? Or did a new discussion forum at the local level in a city? Did it bring new voices to the discussion that were not there before? Did a participatory budgeting instrument where ICT tools enabled citizens to rank different preferences, did it get better projects on the table than were there before? These are, again, very important questions to ask when analyzing the impact or the value of e-democracy tools in a particular setting, be it national, be it local, or within civil society at any level. So this is just to give you some ideas. Of course, there are more indicators. I just put some, but it's very important to think about the impact factor. You know, at the end of the day, what are we getting, or you getting, out of the instruments being used?